Good morning, and really warm welcome to all of you to this event. We are live online as well as in the room. Uh, and I welcome all those who are joining us online, but particularly lovely to see so many of you in the auditorium itself. Um, our session is entitled Why We Disagree About Climate Change. I wanted to start just by saying I think it's quite unlikely that Mike and I are going to be disagreeing a lot with each other. So if you thought that this was a session in which the current head of Department of Geography and the next head of Department of Geography were going to have a public spat, I'm afraid you're going to be a bit disappointed. Uh, it is, however, the title of Mike's book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And I'll explain in a little bit more detail the context within which that's set. So let me introduce myself. I'm Bhaskar Veera. As I said, I'm currently head of Department of Geography here in Cambridge. And I'm joined by Mike Hume, who will be my successor as the next head of department with effect from next Saturday. I think we switch over at midnight on the 30th of September. So this is an opportunity for us to share some ideas and thoughts around a critical question, which of course all of us are interested in, climate change. I've already explained the title of the session is linked to Mike's book, which was published in 2009. And Mike will explain in a little bit more detail the context within which the book was set. What we're going to do is have a half an hour fireside chat. We'll discuss a few sort of key themes. But what we're really keen is to interact with you as an audience. There are roving mics. Since we do have an online audience, when we move into the question and answer session, please wait until a mic comes to you so that the online audience can hear your question as well. And we'll have about half an hour of interaction trying to address the questions and comments that come from the floor. So we expect to finish around noon. So in the forward to this book, Steve Rayner, who's a distinguished climate scientist and writer, commented on the perceived challenges of undertaking research on climate change when he started his career, which would be well over 30 years ago. So in the mid 80s or early 90s, when sort of consciousness about climate change was first becoming visible. Certainly the science community were thinking about this very deeply. But Steve says in the introduction that he was told that climate change would never be a major public policy issue. He was told that the science is too uncertain, the impacts are too far in the future, and there is no readily identifiable villain. Interesting. We sit here slightly 30 years or a bit later from those comments, and I think most people would agree that the science has become a lot more certain. Very few people deny the reality of climate change. Indeed, almost all scientists agree that there is a clear link with human activity. So it's not just that climate change is happening, but it's very much an outcome of human activity, particularly over the last 200 years. Almost no one disagrees with this. His second point was about impacts, and the impacts are also increasingly visible. We only need to look at the unusual summer that we had in this country. We only need to look at things like the devastating floods that have covered a third of Pakistan this summer to see that there are very real consequences already. And for many people who live particularly in the global south, climate change is there present. It's not some distant future. And there's increasing consensus that as a result of that, acting early is likely to be a lot more beneficial than delaying our responses. The third point that was made was about identifying a villain. That's interesting as well. The legal system is increasingly recognizing ways to attribute responsibility for past action or inaction to particular groups in relation to climate change. And just yesterday, there was a very interesting case which involved the Torres Strait Islanders, who have successfully taken out a case in the United Nations Human Rights Commission against the government of Australia, and they have been held culpable for not taking action to avert climate change, which is impacting on the human rights of these 8 people who are the 8 Torres Strait Islanders who've taken out this court case. So if you're interested, there's detail of it online. This case has just been concluded. So this issue around culpability and responsibility is also now getting forms of legal recognition that perhaps were difficult to think about 30 years ago. And of course, those who are victims are also no longer invisible to us. We used to talk about future generations as though they were some kind of hypothetical unborn community. Well, that future generation is with us, as the school strikes movement has shown us so powerfully. They are the current young people who are demanding action of those who've gone before them. So the victims themselves are also very visible and very identifiable, both those who are living in the global south and experiencing the huge impacts of climate change, as well as those who might be experiencing it 30 years from today as a consequence of the actions or the lack of action that we take. So if there is so much convergence on these issues, why do we still disagree? I think that's the context in which I want to hand over to Mike, who will tell you a little bit about what he was thinking about around 2007, 2008, when I think the genesis of this book was first formed, but also then whether, Mike, you think those issues are still as lively today as they were when you were writing the book.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction, and lovely to see everybody. For those of you who don't know, I started off my career in geography. I trained as a geographer, did my PhD in Sudan, looking at climate and society interactions in Sudan in the early 1980s, which itself was a very interesting time in Northeast Africa because of major famine that in the end probably led to around 500,000 people dying. It was a whole Band-Aid phenomenon, if people can remember that. I was there and trying to work out just what role rainfall variability and rainfall changes in that part of Africa had on those communities. I then worked for probably 15 or so years in climate science, working with climatic data, working with modelers. I'm not a modeler, but I worked with modelers, assessing how credible and reliable the models were, how we could use models to create scenarios of the future that governments and businesses in both the public and private sector might use. That was with the Climatic Research Unit. And then in 2000, I led a consortium that secured funding from our research councils to set up something called the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, based at the University of East Anglia. And I led that for 7 years. And that took me to 2007. And finishing my stint of 7 years, I then had a sabbatical year, which is when I actually wrote this book. And I think 2007, I obviously started off in climate science. I then ran an interdisciplinary center working with engineers, with social scientists, economists, ecologists, a much wider range of disciplines. And clearly by 2007, as Bhaskar alluded, climate change was a major public policy issue by 2007. Tony Blair, during his 7 years in government, for example, here in the UK, made that one of his top priorities. You can be cynical if you want and say that was a reaction to the disaster of the Iraq War, but nevertheless, climate change in British public policy was center stage by the mid-2000s. But what was concerning me was that, and I was coming out of an academic community, scientific community of maybe 100 or 120 researchers, and there was an unspoken assumption that we all agreed about what the solutions were. We were researching solutions. We recognized the problem. But actually what was occurring to me is that we didn't all think exactly on the same tracks about what sort of solutions would actually be most appropriate or indeed most pragmatic or practical or feasible given the complex politics of climate change. And so that got me thinking about the different dimensions around which, and of course I was doing a lot of public speaking around this time and listening to audiences both here and in Europe and occasionally in America hearing the sort of questions that people had, and of course reading as well about some of the either the outright denialist arguments, but then the more sort of moderate skeptics, and trying to sort of piece together what actually were these axes along which disagreements might quite legitimately emerge about what to do. And I had 7 of them in the book. I looked at how we understand the nature of scientific knowledge, how we value things economically or not economically, in monetarized terms or not, the role of religion and religious worldviews and moralities, how we perceive risk as different individuals in different cultures, how the media operates in communicating and mediating risk, our differences in how we think of what we could call well-being. What actually is, what does it look like to live well as a human in many, many different places, of course, around the world? And then finally, how we wish to be governed. What sort of arrangements do different societies and cultures choose to adopt in order to live together when we don't all disagree? And of course, across all of the 7 dimensions, there are quite legitimate reasons why we might reach different conclusions about how we deal with a complex problem like climate change. I just wrote it because I had a sabbatical year, and it was sort of almost like a brain dump of my previous 20 years of work on climate change. I never quite expected it would circulate as widely as it did, and it actually still is selling now 15 years later. And it just seemed to, at that moment, around 2007, 2008, 2009, it just seemed to help people to make sense of some of these troubling questions. I mean, that Bhaskar, I suppose, alluded to, why is, and going back to Steve Rayner, you quoted in the introduction, Steve was one of a number of people who worked actually under Mary Douglas, the anthropologist in the middle parts of the 20th century at UCL. And Mary Douglas, I think, was part of the thinking that led to this idea of what we call cultural theory. And recognizing there are different ways that people see themselves living in social settings. And it ended up being the hierarchs, the egalitarians, the individualists, and the fatalists. And that led to thinking about what Steve Rayner talked about: wicked problems, as opposed to tame problems. And one answer to your question, Bhaskar, is why do we still disagree? Why do we still find it difficult, given all that's happening in the world and all of the civic protests and so on around climate? Why do we still find it difficult to bend the curve, if you will, of emissions? Is because climate change is a wicked problem and not a tame one. And just to get your head around this, a good example of a tame problem would be the depletion of stratospheric ozone. So this, again, was emerging in the 1980s when I was starting my career. CFCs and other halocarbons enter into the stratosphere through chemical reactions, deplete ozone. That leads to increased UV radiation at the surface. And that is a major, certainly in the 1980s, it was a major concern that unmitigated, this could lead to major health. But that was a tame problem in the sense that the villains, if you like, in this case, actually, were a very small category of chemicals produced by pretty much just 2 major companies in the world at that time, DuPont and ICI. And if you could, so as a tame problem, if you could make this sort of incisive intervention, as it were, a bit like surgery in the human body, you could extract the cancer. And to some degree, that's what happens. Certainly the most depleting of the halocarbons no longer are produced, except by a few rogue companies in East Asia. And slowly, ozone levels are recovering. So that's a tame problem. Climate change is wicked because it's not. You can't just do that incisive keyhole surgery. To extract from the global economy our fossil dependencies are not just basic production of energy, but all of the other energy services that go along with that fossil-based economy is extraordinarily difficult for obvious reasons. We can talk about those later if need be. So it's a wicked problem, not a tame problem. And that's why we need to understand, in my view, why we need to understand, and it's not just a case, more science, better science, more certain science, better communication, get rid of the deniers, expose the public to that science. That isn't a solution, because it actually touches on things, if I could put it this way, that science can't really touch or finds difficult to touch, which is about our worldviews, our values, our religions, our sense of justice and injustice. So science alone is clearly not the solution. Begs the question, what is?
I'll read out another bit, and then maybe we're going to talk about a couple of contemporary themes to kind of bring this discussion sort of to the present day. So further on in the forward, Steve writes, climate change is actually not even a discrete problem to be solved, but it's a condition under which human beings will have to make choices about matters such as our priorities for economic development and the way we govern ourselves. Our recognition of climate change as a threat to the ways of life to which we are accustomed and which we value depends on our views of nature, our judgments about scientific analysis, our perceptions of risk, and our ideas about what is at stake. Economic growth, pretty topical today. National sovereignty, another pretty important theme. Species extinction, or the lives of poor people in marginal environments of developing countries, and whether it is ethically, politically, or economically justifiable to make trade-offs between these. These are all things that we hold dear and important. And even when scientists, politicians, and publics agree on the basic principles and the most robust findings of climate science, there is still plenty of room for disagreement about what the implications of that science are for action. The notion that science drives some kind of consensus in society on policy and that better science will help us to settle our differences ignores the roots of those differences, which lie in political, national, organizational, religious, and intellectual culture. What is taken for granted by one group of people is uncomfortable knowledge that is hard for another to accept because of the implications for ideas and resource commitments that they hold dear. And one theme that brings this really kind of forefront is the energy transition. Now, of course, there was a sort of strong movement towards renewables and a desire to shift away from our dependence on a fossil fuel-based economy, which has clearly been severely disrupted by the impacts of the Ukraine war and our vulnerabilities to particular sources of energy and our dependence on them and the consequences on every sector of society, the inflationary pressures that we're experiencing have just made it very visible. And of course, the immediate reactions to that are ones about trying to find alternative sources of the same fossil fuels. And that could be seen as a sort of serious setback to what people might have seen as progress in certain directions. But it brings the trade-offs really starkly into visibility, because if you have a cost of living crisis, you have to try and alleviate it with the most immediate sources of energy that are available. You can't wait for alternatives to come on stream, which will take 5, 10, maybe 15 years.
It is a good illustration, I think. I mean, there are two interesting things about Putin's war and the disruption that's created from a climate perspective. I mean, on one hand, you can say, which is a very sensible thing to say, it just shows why over-dependency on an energy resource that is controlled by unpredictable and uncontrollable political agents is not a good route to go down. And therefore, the irony, for example, with Germany, was that as it decarbonized and as it denuclearized, which is another question about the role of nuclear in all this, but as it sought to increase its proportion of energy from renewables, it actually found itself during the 2010s increasing more and more gas from Russia. So it went from something like 20% to something like 50% during that decade. So it shows these deep interdependencies, and what one country does for climate-friendly reasons might actually have perverse outcomes further down the line. And of course, who would have predicted Putin's war? And this is another challenge, in all of this. The whole climate science community, or the broader intellectual, academic, analytical community about climate change, have models. They have models of the climate system, that can do a reasonable job at seeing into the future. They have models of energy economics, which do a rather less credible job, but still they have some skill. But no models can see 50 or 100 years into the future and can predict when Putin will go to war in Ukraine. Or they can't predict when a pandemic is going to hit the world in the year 2037. Or when America falls into civil war in 15 years' time because of the polarization that has been gradually deepening in American political life, and that Trump has, these are geopolitical events that are not seeable by models. And yet we know that they happen. Or if we pretended, that these sort of things didn't happen, we're deluding ourselves. I mean, 3 of these in the last 5 years, the election of Trump, I would say, the pandemic, and now Putin's war, these are major shocks in the system. And suddenly your policies that were beginning to gain some traction are thrown off kilter. And we're seeing some of the consequences of that. And it remains to be seen. I mean, you could look at this in a good way. What the price of oil has increased. So countries like Qatar, Saudi, their revenues are increasing hugely as a consequence of the oil price increase. Now, you could say that actually gives them an additional investment window in order to accelerate. And some of the more progressive political analysts in the Middle East would actually see this, that actually, okay, we'll take this bonanza that Putin has given us to accelerate our investment, for example, in hydrogen or massive solar rollouts. Whether that remains to be seen is another matter. But the pieces of the jigsaw have moved in quite unpredictable ways. And it just adds another layer of uncertainty into how the challenges of climate change are going to be met. There's also a justice question. I mean, how does this look in India, for example? Because India still has a significant coal industry.
Absolutely.
And one of the other questions about the energy transition is this whole thing about justice for some of the more marginalized who work and dependent on these fossil industries.
No, absolutely. So people think that India's coal production is going to peak at about 2030, 2031. So there's still another decade of coal-based energy. And the energy justice issue is really important. So my family comes from a village which is about 3 hours from Delhi, the national capital. And that village still doesn't have 24 hours of electricity. So kids can't study in the evenings because there are no lights for them to study from. And this is 3 hours from the national capital of a booming country. So this question around energy justice, just being able to find ways to provide light for kids so that they can study at night, is an illustration of these kind of really deep challenges. Now, coal is at the moment India's cheapest energy source. The cost of renewables has come down a lot. Solar is becoming pretty significant. And coming to my sort of village example, one of the interesting questions is, can we move towards off-grid forms of energy provision? So micro solar, which is just giving a household the ability to light themselves through a micro solar rather than for a grid-based solar solution, which is you've probably seen these massive solar farms that are being proposed, which will then supply energy into the grid and will become an alternative to the grid-based, coal-based system. And sure, that should happen too. But if you're trying to address these energy justice issues, actually a smaller scale, more locally appropriate solution might well be a quicker fix rather than waiting for these big transitions to take place. Because for those bigger transitions, I think the sort of infrastructure changes are going to be much more significant.
Yeah,
But,
and if I mean India is a good case to get us out of our sort of Western Eurocentric mindset around climate change. Another good perspective would be to go to Africa or to go to parts of West Africa, for example, or some of the East African countries with very rapid population growth rates still. I mean, the estimates from the demographers would put at least another billion, maybe getting closer to 2 billion people arriving on the planet in the next 30 years. And if you look at some of the African countries, Nigeria, somewhere at around, I think around about 250 million at the moment, probably going to end up at 500 million, if not more than that. So how is Nigeria as a country going to meet those demands of the existing population plus another 250 million people in ways that are not simply replicating large-scale fossil-based energy infrastructures? So if one, and as good geographers, we, at least in our imagination, if not on our bodies, we move around the world and the planet and look at these types of problems from these different geographic perspectives. And as geographers, that is what we do. And we begin again to see, in a way, this is another axis, I suppose, along my 7. It's not just those 7 dimensions. It actually, how does that look from, from Lagos or from Addis Ababa or from Jakarta in Indonesia? These questions around climate change look and feel quite different in those different geographic locations.
Mike, the other justice issue that's becoming very topical and really important, especially in the run-up to this year's Conference of the Parties, is around how those who are the victims of existing climate-related extreme events perceive that injustice. So a lot of the evidence suggests that those who are least responsible for climate change are often at the mercy of these extreme events. People living in low-lying island states who probably haven't contributed huge to the historic stock of greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of people in Africa where increasing droughts, increasing impacts on their productivity of the agricultural systems, fluctuations in weather patterns, which are creating uncertainties around farming cycles. Countries like Pakistan, which have contributed almost nothing to historic emissions, but a third of the country is now underwater, are beginning to talk the language of what is being called loss and damage. And the next conference, climate change conference, is going to take place in Egypt in November this year. And a coalition of countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, some of the small island states, are actually talking about this very seriously as the need for compensatory payment. So that the victims of climate change are actually compensated for the losses that they are already experiencing. And they are trying to make that a sort of focus of political discussion over the next few months, and raises really difficult questions, particularly around I mean, you've studied, or you've observed climate negotiations for a long time. It seems quite unlikely that in a forum like that, those who are seen as the perpetrators of climate change will willingly agree to pay the victims. I mean, it's quite unlikely that the Americans or the Chinese are actually going to willingly say, well, yes, we think we should compensate you.
Yeah. So this is another sort of point of friction in the international geopolitics of climate change, for sure. And the interesting thing about the loss and damage question is in a sense it rewrites a much longer story, which is inextricably tied up with questions around economic development and colonialism, and just the sheer questions about inequality and inequity in a complex world. So for example, when I was a student studying geography in the late 1970s, climate change was not a public policy issue. It wasn't a student campaigning issue at all. What actually, got people on the streets and protesting in the late 1970s, I can remember this well, was about the terms of trade with what we now call the global south, or the third world as we called it then. Questions about fair trade in the late 1970s was the issue. And in a sense, what climate change is doing is in a way rewriting that story with this new dynamic now. It's not simply about all of the economic power is held in Washington or in London. Actually, we have climate change now as the manifestation of inequality and differential vulnerabilities, which centuries of unequal development, sometimes confounded by colonialism. It's now climate change, if you like, is exposing some of these inequities. And this makes the story much more complicated, because is the best thing to be doing in order to attend to the most vulnerable, trying to bend the curve of carbon globally and pouring your resources into that target? Because we know just the sheer inertia of the global system is that even if we began to bend that carbon curve, or the emissions curve, even getting it down, the climate system will keep on warming for another 30 or 40 years. So that's another 30 or 40 years of vulnerabilities of some of the poorest people being exposed to extreme weather. Or how actually, or rather than trying to bend the curve, are you best off if there are well-intentioned international agreements to help the most vulnerable, actually find smarter, more precise ways of intervening to reduce vulnerabilities and enhance the resilience of people's livelihoods in the face of things like flooding in Pakistan? What actually is the most effective forms of intervention? And you can answer that question in different ways, I think. But it comes back to all of the politics of development and how best. I mean, in Britain, Boris liked to call it levelling up, but if you look at that globally, how best globally should we be thinking about levelling up? What is the best thing for richer institutions in the West or the North to do to provide that longer term perspective on the most vulnerable?
And obviously, in a world where resources and our ability to focus on these problems is also finite, there are inevitably trade-offs between those choices, because I think what you're talking about is that historical inequality of development trajectories has meant that people's ability to cope, their adaptive capacity in the technical language, is highly unequally distributed. So we are definitely in a world where prevention of climate change seems unlikely. It is happening already, and people are exposed differentially depending on how much their systems can actually cope with the changes that are already visible. And as Mike has said, the inertia within the system suggests that whatever we do today, there will continue to be changes over the next 2-3 decades, which people will have to respond to, will have to adapt to. So do we invest in building adaptive capacity? And should that be seen as a trade-off with reducing emissions, so that we also sort of slow down the future buildup of these climate impacts?
And people then, react to the idea of trade-offs. No, let's look for the win-wins. And for sure, you can do some smart thinking to find out, actually, can you, as it were, both reduce dependencies on fossil carbon at the same time as enhancing livelihoods and resilience? And there are some strategies. However, the difficulties here about trade-offs and win-wins is that the political actors and the political interests are different. And the realpolitik of doing this at an international scale means that the coalition of actors who might see incentives to decarbonize might not be the same coalition of actors who see incentives to enhance adaptation. So trying to convert trade-offs into win-wins, of course, is a nice aspiration to have, but it is far from easy to necessarily see how those win-wins will always emerge in particular places.
So, Mike, the techno-optimists talk about things like the green economy and green jobs and the opportunities for Africa, as you've mentioned, to leapfrog, to miss out the highly polluting fossil fuel-based phases of energy production, because actually from a low energy context, you can leapfrog directly into the brave new world of renewables without having to go through the intermediate stages of highly polluting fossil fuels. So the sort of win-win scenarios are around this kind of optimism around the green economy transition, which will bring with it green jobs, will bring with it opportunities for young people. Those 200 million young Nigerians also need to have jobs, not just energy. Uh, so that's the sort of win-win rhetoric. Uh, but the reality of the ways in which we've seen international development play out for decades suggests that that might be wishful thinking.
As always, and it comes again down to one of sort of these fundamental axes of disagreement is your attitude to technology, innovation is technology. Techno optimist, the techno pessimist, and I mean, how do you resolve that? I mean, and if anything, actually, I'm more on the techno-optimist side. I'm sort of more on that innovation, technological solution, I suppose, would be more where my instincts would tend to take me. But we know the history of all new innovation and technologies is mixed at best, and it produces losers. It alters the landscape, but it doesn't just level everyone up. It still has differential impacts. But I personally can't see. I can't see a world, and you mentioned about the whole question about economic growth. There's the discourse now of degrowth. Personally, I cannot see this as a viable, practical framework within which international geopolitics around climate change is going to unfold. I mean, the idea that one can persuade major economies to adopt a position of degrowth seems to me entirely implausible. And it certainly is implausible when you start looking at some of the developing countries in the South, where their argument is, don't put constraints on us. We have got these unmet development needs for basic human well-being. And that really, I think, has got to be an innovation and technology challenge, for me anyway. I think it has to be met through, as best we can, through investment in technologies that simply make non-fossil infrastructures cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen this beginning to happen, as you mentioned already in a few cases, and we just need to keep that pressure on the on the pedal the whole time. Putin's war has not helped in that regard.
I'm definitely with you on that as well, Mike. I think we have to bring to bear the fruits of all the technologies that can help to accelerate these transitions. One last thing before we hand over to the audience. I think one of the other things that's probably changed a little bit, at least from when the book was written, is the nature of the public discourse. I think there's a much more lively public discourse on these issues. I've mentioned the school strikes already. Obviously, young people are very energized and mobilized around this. But there are also calls for things like citizens' juries and public panels for public deliberation. Actually, there's a sense that this debate is moving over from the science community, which had dominated these conversations, into a much more mass conversation in society. And of course, that comes with both risks and opportunities. I just wondered what you thought.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been political activism around climate change. I mean, again, if we go right the way back to the beginning of my career in the 1980s, it was NGOs, international NGOs, particularly Greenpeace and WWF, who were the most vocal advocates, beyond scientists, but actually bringing this issue into public policy, public awareness was driven by those international NGOs, and of course they're still campaigning on those topics. and then around the edges of this, there have been always sort of new social movements spinning out. When I was writing the book, there was in the run-up to the Copenhagen conference in 2009, there was a new social movement in the UK called Plain Stupid, challenging the narrative of uncontrolled growth in aviation, and that their focus was on it. So there've always been new social movements emerging, and in the last few years we've seen a number of these. 2018 was actually quite important in that regard. I think in the middle of Trump's presidency and the British vote to leave the European Union, that was when Greta Thunberg decided to start her school strike, and partly catalyzed by that, but also a longer history of involvement in the Occupy movement, Extinction Rebellion, emerged in 2018. And now we have Britain, we have other groups like Insulate Britain and so on, Just Stop Oil. So in a sense, new social movements are always in the making. I think the Fridays for the Future is perhaps a more interesting one, and partly for the reasons you said about this whole intergenerational. So that was a dynamic that I think was completely lacking when I wrote the book. Yeah. People talked about intergenerational ethics in the academic community in a very abstract way and philosophical way. And of course, there are some real ethical and philosophical challenges as how do you allow the unborn to speak into our political life today? Or indeed, how do you allow species to speak? But I think what Thunberg has catalyzed is simply the visibility of a new generation of people many of whom will be alive in 2100 still. And that I think that's good for democracy. What I think some of the risks and the dangers of some of the discourse, certainly just the last few years, is if it becomes a discourse that loses faith in democracy, that says, well, you, us, my generation, maybe our generation, or you politicians over there, you have let us down. If that translates into a cynicism or a disillusionment with democracy, I see one or two dangers of this. And over the last 10 years, the rise of other forms of political populism that trample upon the institutions, certainly in Western Europe, in the liberal tradition that have taken 250 years to create. There's a danger that actually that simply drives a larger proportion of our people into thinking, well, it's time to give up on democracy. And this does concern me somewhat around the edges of some of these new social movements that could have, again, further destabilizing effects, rather than the effect that they want, which is sort of a radical social transformation and the dismantling of capitalism. What you actually may find is you've not just dismantled capitalism, but you've actually dismantled 250 years of liberal democracy.
Mike, I think we should draw our audience in now. We've got two microphones roving. If you can identify yourself, there's a gentleman over there whose hand has just gone up. Please try and speak into the mic so that our audience online can hear you as well.
Sure, I'll do my best. Well, thank you very much both for that discussion. My question is about the energy transition in Europe, where there seems to be a broad consensus that urgent action is needed in Europe for the energy transition this decade, but progress is still incremental compared to what is widely acknowledged as needed. So I want to ask, what genuinely can accelerate policy action towards a faster energy transition, and what can people do to effectively bend that curve faster? Thank you.
Well, let's be positive. I mean, let's look at the positives from Putin's war. I mean, there are lots of negatives about it, but certainly one of the positives, and actually this is where the Europeans are doing a much better job, it seems to me, from what I've been hearing about policy than the UK is actually drawing attention back on questions about energy efficiency. One of the criticisms of 30 years of climate politics or energy politics around climate change is governments, big governments, like interventions on the supply side. And academics and analysts for year after year have argued that actually there are some real wins to be gained by focusing on energy efficiencies, reducing demand, increasing the efficiencies of existing infrastructures. There's low-hanging fruit in the economic jargon, and this country, Britain, has been very, very poor at prioritizing that, and we see this even now with I don't know what do we call it, the Johnson Truss handover, but yes, focusing on the supply side, but very little attention on the demand side or the efficiency side. So even, I mean, I'm not an economist. You're an economist, Bhaskar. You can tell me. I mean, it seems to me crazy that if the government's going to bail out the British population with, what is it, 60 billion, you put a price cap. You say you're not going to spend more than 2,500 per household, but there's no incentive actually to use energy in your home more efficiently. Yep. Whereas you could have done some other form of economic instrument that would actually have provided incentives for behavioral change to reduce your energy use. So too many solutions are supply oriented, whereas I think the Europeans, from what I've gathered, are actually providing new policy instruments, given the shortage of energy we're going to have for the next 2 or 3 years, to drive further efficiencies in both in industry and in domestic settings.
Yeah, I mean, Germany certainly initiated some demand reduction measures, and I think you're right. I mean, you can design much smarter interventions, which both incentivize the consumption side as well as potentially enhance the supply side. I mean, another example was the windfall tax that was not called a windfall tax that Rishi Sunak introduced in May, came with an offset to energy companies if they increase if they expanded into further oil exploration, if they could reinvest their tax savings. So actually you could get off 90% of your tax liability by expanding further oil production, which is exactly what they should not have been incentivizing. So there's all kinds of perverse incentives built into the sort of economic interventions that have been designed in the last few months. I think we've got hands all over. So there's one there and then a couple in the front. I think I've seen 3 in front.
Gerald Coles, you hinted at one of the great taboos in the world, which is population growth. We're not taking it seriously. We're not doing anything about it. And surely that is a major, major contribution to climate change.
So it's not as much part of public discourse, but I wouldn't necessarily say we're not doing anything about it or indeed not taking it seriously. So the demographic transitions that have taken place in several parts of the world are actually quite dramatic. So in parts of India already we're at below replacement fertility. So we're actually seeing declines in birth rates in southern India. That transition is also taking place in other places. So the availability, and Bangladesh is a fantastic example actually. If you look at the data of Bangladesh's transition over the last 20 years, and these are policies that have been explicitly designed, making available the need for contraception and family planning, which is being made available from the supply side. But also there's a really definite focus on things like education, particularly of young women, which enable them to have greater control over their fertility decisions. So I wouldn't necessarily characterize the population debate as being as stagnant, but you're right. The population driver, as Mike has already alluded to, is a really important one, and we need to take that seriously and continue to take it seriously.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing to say is even if you target population as a dimension of the issue, you've got to be thinking very, very carefully about the sort of policy interventions. There've been previous eras. I mean, obviously in India with enforced sterilization or incentivized sterilization that really is ethically rather questionable. Or you can look at China's one child policy, but these are not particularly, I would suggest, not particularly good policy interventions to make around population. So one's got to think very carefully about how one does attend to that dimension. And I mean, the examples Bhaskar has given, the other is back to the economic development. It is about emancipation of women. It's about education of women. It's about economic growth. These are very, very strong correlates. of fertility. And just to complicate matters, if you then also throw in cultural and religious taboos, you can begin to see why there may be a reluctance in some quarters to tackle, as it were, population head on and find sort of side door or backdoor policies into the question.
Should we take 3 comments in together, and then maybe we can try and address all of them, Mike? So we'll just have to make a note of the questions. So yeah, please go ahead.
You've laid out the problem very clearly. When I left here more than 50 years ago, I went and worked for ICI, like lots of us. They had a nuclear reactor at Billingham, which produced radioisotopes for cancer treatment and other industrial uses. That reactor used uranium mixed with zirconium hydride. The result of that was that the fuel pellets were self-regulating. There was no chance of a temperature excursion. Perfectly safe, just in a tank of water. Why? That was 50 years ago. Why can that not be used for district heating?
Thank you. Let's take another one.
Hello, my name's Chris Williams. My question relates to the climate change models. And as someone with a scientific background, but not at the coal face of climate change like you guys are, it is very concerning that major global decisions appear to be made on models which, when they are back-checked against actual data, bear no resemblance to the reality of what is actually going on. That is a major, major concern that seems to be glossed over by everyone.
Thank you. And I think we had a question here.
It seems to me sort of fairly demonstrable that capitalism, in a sense, has had many benefits, but also doesn't work in the sense that the West has become a sort of imperialist or colonialist power. It also seems evident that communism, as in the Soviet style or Chinese style or North Korean style, doesn't work either, because it's not really communism, it's another form of imperialism. So both of these are forms of injustice. I often think of John Donne's quotation that no man is an island, but also, of course, no island is an island. And yet we in the UK and many other Western countries seem to think we can treat this global problem as though we are an island and we have a right to unfettered economic growth, which seems to me to be clearly impossible and unjust. This affects not only climate change, but loss of biodiversity and so forth, and extinction of species. I don't know if you have a reaction to that, but I have a concern about, you were talking about how things are unpredictable, like Putin's war. What is the risk of societal collapse under, for example, activist regimes or activist movements?
Thank you. I think I'm going to invite one final comment. I don't want to pick on you particularly, but I think the person sitting with the yellow striped shirt here might be the youngest member of the audience. Did you have a question for us? Wait for the mic to get to you.
I think one of the biggest issues at the moment concerning climate change and all could be the damages to the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, and with the recent Brazilian government decisions to kind of neglect the ecosystem that the Amazon rainforest has, and obviously the Amazon rainforest fires that have been going on are quite awful, as a matter of fact. But what do you think could be a trade-off between obviously Brazilian economic growth and the protection of the biggest ecosystem probably in the world?
Thank you. Mike, do you want to have a
Well,
go?
I'll take a couple of those and maybe see if you've got any. I mean, just on the question about the models. So, you know, I spent the first half of my career looking at this question. And I follow the more recent science without actually doing any of it myself. I think if we look at some of the variables that climate models are simulating, so let's look at some of the headline ones like concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So the biogeochemical models will simulate concentrations of CO2 concentration. If we look at the headline figure of global surface, mean surface average air temperature, or if we look at global mean sea level. So these are three of the top level indicators that indicate the direction of travel for the planet. All the current generation models do an extremely good job at simulating those. Where the models have difficulty, and this was true back in the 1990s when I was looking at them, and they still do actually, is if you start looking at some of the regional hydrological variables. So what happens to Asian monsoons? What happens to, actually it comes back to the Brazilian question, what actually happens to Brazilian rainfall and therefore potential implications for the Amazon? Models do vary in their simulation of those factors. So I think, I don't think one can question that our ability to simulate aggregate global level indicators is extremely good. I think the problems come when we look at smaller scales, regions, in particular hydrological, moisture-related variables. And that's why when, you know, the argument about adaptation is one should build adaptive strategies that are robust at regional and local scales across a variety of different outcomes. But at the global level, I don't see any major concern that models are either disagreeing with each other or converging from reality. And you could look, I mean, if you're interested, I can tell you a couple of papers about that, about just looking at the global temperature curves over the last 50 years. I'm not a nuclear engineer or scientist, so I think it was quite a technical question you were asking. The only thing I'd say, for what it's worth, about nuclear energy, I went through a sort of a gestalt change around the year 2000. I was very anti-nuclear energy up until around the year 2000, and partly actually setting up the Tyndall Centre, it brought me into contact with engineers for the first time, research engineers, academic engineers. And I began to rethink actually the role, or my attitude, my perceptions of nuclear energy in the context of this larger concern about climate change. So I actually feel quite strongly that nuclear is never going to be, it's not a magic solution, but it certainly has to be part of an energy portfolio that transitions the world away from fossil. So I think that's absolutely clear. And I think, interestingly, quite a number of the quite high-profile environmental campaigners in the NGO community have also made that transition. A little bit later than me, perhaps, but in the last few years, they've actually recognised that nuclear should be seen as a technology that transitions away from fossil. Well, it doesn't entirely solve the problem. I don't think you can convert the 85% of the world's energy that is fossil-based at the moment to nuclear, but you can certainly see it as a contributing technology.
I'll just conclude with a couple of sort of quick remarks, picking up on the governance questions, maybe, and then we need to come to a halt as well. So, I mean, I think what you asked about is, you know, which is the best system of government that hasn't yet been invented, and none of them seem to work, whether it's Bolsonaro's populism in Brazil, which I think comes to the final question that was asked here, or whether the kind of the obvious failings of capitalism as we see it, or the communist experiments that have been visible. None of them seem to really. I think the time horizon of political decision making really is at the core of this, and the time horizons for environmental change and impact are always much longer term, and the rewards to politicians are much shorter term. And I think there is very little convergence between those time horizons, and we haven't squared that governance circle. So I don't have a solution, but I think that's an articulation of the challenge that we face. I want to conclude by thanking everyone for their attention, for being here in the audience, for those who joined us online. Mike, thank you for a really enjoyable conversation. Good luck in a week's time when I hand over the department to you.
Well, thank you for handing that over.
But it's lovely to see all of you, and thank you very much.